The air in the great hall of the northern fang was thick with the scent of pine smoke, roasted venison, and the heavy metallic tang of pack dominance. The hunter's moon, a perfect cold silver disk, stared down through the high smoke hole in the roof, its light spearing the gloom and glinting off the frost-kissed antlers mounted on the timbered walls. For hours, Saris Dunlore had made herself small, a gray stone in a river of boisterous wolves, her back pressed against the cold granite of the hearth's edge. She kept her eyes down, her hands tucked into the worn sleeves of her homespun tunic, praying for the night to end. The murmurs of the pack, the deep-chested laughter of the warriors, the sharp gossip of the she-wolves. It was all a familiar torment, a language she heard but could no longer truly speak. But tonight the air was different. It was stretched thin, vibrating with a tension that had nothing to do with the usual Thal pack squabbles. It was because he was here, the Alpha King. His presence had silenced the hall an hour ago, not with a command, but with his very existence. He had walked in flanked by his stone guard, and the noise had simply died, swallowed by the sheer weight of his aura. Now the sounds had returned, but they were subdued, cautious. He sat at the high table, a figure carved from mountain shadow and winter frost, saying nothing, merely observing. Every wolf in the room felt his gaze, a physical pressure on their skin. Every wolf but her, she had hoped. She had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being unseen, of being less than a ghost. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, a dreadful certainty grew in her stomach, cold and sharp. The silence that had fallen was aimed not at the room, but directly at her. And she knew, even before she dared to look up, that the king was about to speak. The question came without warning, cutting through the strained quiet. It wasn't a roar or a command, but a low, almost conversational timbre that was somehow more terrifying than either. "So, you're still unclaimed?" The words fell into the hall like stones into a frozen lake. Every head turned, every whisper ceased. The world narrowed to the space between her and the high table. Saris's breath caught, a painful little snag in her throat. She forced herself to lift her gaze, to meet the eyes of the Alpha King, Jastor Venmark. They were not the fiery gold of a common alpha. They were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, piercing gray that seemed to absorb all the light and warmth in the room. Scars, old and white, mapped the hard planes of his face, one trailing from his temple and disappearing into the dark, thick beard that framed a stern mouth. He didn't look cruel. He looked ancient, inevitable, like a force of nature that did not concern itself with the lives of lesser things. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, unclaimed. The word was a brand, a mark of shame she wore seared into her very soul. It meant broken, it meant cursed. It meant the mate the fates had promised her had been stolen by a rogue's teeth 5 years ago, on the eve of their bonding ceremony, leaving her forever tethered to a ghost. It meant she was an omega, not by rank, but by tragedy, an empty vessel in a pack that valued bonds and lineage above all else. Her throat was dry, a desert of fear. The pack's eyes were on her, 100 pairs of gleaming, curious, pitying points of light. She could feel their thoughts like bee stings. The Dunlore girl, the one whose mate was killed, the barren one. The king waited, his patience a cold, heavy blanket smothering the hall. Silence was not an option. Defiance was suicide. She had to answer. Yes. The word was a tiny thing, a wisp of sound, barely more than a breath, but in the cathedral-like silence, it echoed like a scream. She watched it travel across the space between them, watched it land. Jastor's expression did not change. His posture remained relaxed, one powerful hand resting beside a silver goblet. It was a mask of perfect control, but Saris, who had spent a lifetime learning to read the subtle shifts in predators, saw the truth beneath it. She saw it in the fractional tightening of the muscle in his jaw, the faint tremor in the massive shoulders beneath his black furs, and she smelled it. His scent, which had been a distant, clean fragrance of cold mountain air and ozone, suddenly deepened, thickening with something primal and possessive. It was the scent of a wolf stirring from a long slumber, the low, dangerous rumble of a power that had been held in careful check. It coiled around her, a possessive tendril of smoke, staking a claim in the air she breathed. The growl was not audible to the room, but she felt it in her bones. A deep, resonant vibration that traveled from the stone floor, up through her legs, and settled low in her belly. A collective nervous shuffle rippled through the pack. The other alphas at the high table, broad-shouldered and proud, subtly angled themselves away from their king, an instinctual submission to a will far greater than their own. The air crackled. Unclaimed, in the eyes of a lesser wolf, meant unwanted, pitiable, but her single whispered word had just taught her a terrifying new lesson. To an alpha king, a man who ruled territories that stretched from the sun-scorched south to the frozen northern peaks, unclaimed did not mean unwanted. It meant available. It meant exposed. It meant his for the taking. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a passing observation. It was an assessment, a hunter sighting his quarry. The polite curiosity was a lie, a carefully crafted veil over a predatory intent so profound it made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her shame curdled into pure, ice-cold fear. She dropped her gaze, staring at the worn leather of her boots, hoping the floor would swallow her whole. But it was too late. The king's attention was a spotlight, and she was pinned in its merciless beam. He rose from his seat, the scrape of the heavy chair against the stone floor, a deafening roar in the silence. He was larger than she had realized, a mountain of a man who blocked out the light of the fire. As he descended the few steps from the high platform, he moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly at odds with his immense size. He wasn't walking, he was prowling. The pack parted before him, a sea of fur and fear receding from his path. Saris's breath hitched. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee into the forest and never look back. But her feet were rooted to the spot, encased in the ice of his will. He stopped just before her, so close she had to crane her neck to see his face. The heat rolling off his body was immense, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep within her. His shadow fell over her, consuming her. The scent of him was overwhelming now, winter storms, ancient pines, and the dark, musky scent of a dominant male wolf at its peak. It was suffocating, intoxicating, terrifying. "Look at me," he commanded. The voice was still quiet, a low murmur meant only for her, yet it held the absolute authority of a king. Slowly, trembling, she lifted her head. His gray eyes bored into hers, and she felt stripped bare, every fear, every secret sorrow laid open for his inspection. He saw the ghost of her lost love. He saw the years of loneliness, the quiet agony of being an outcast. He saw it all, and he was not moved by pity. He was moved by something far older, far more dangerous. His gaze dropped, tracing the line of her throat where a bonding mark should have been. The skin there tingled, as if he had physically touched her. "The Dunlore family, he mused, his voice a low rumble, a strong line. It has been too long since it was bound to the heart of the North. His words were not for her. They were a pronouncement, a justification for what was to come. He was speaking of her like she was a parcel of land, a treaty to be signed. Panic clawed at her throat, sharp and frantic. She had to say something, anything. "My king," she began, her voice cracking. I am not worthy of notice. My line is ended." It was the truth, the one she had lived with for 5 years. She was a dead end, barren of hope, barren of a future. A flicker of something, annoyance, crossed his face. The fates decide when a line is ended. Not tragedy, not grief. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that slid down her spine like melting ice. "And you are wrong. You have been noticed." His hand came up, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would strike her. She flinched, a small, pathetic movement she instantly regretted. But his fingers did not touch her face. Instead, they brushed against a loose strand of her dark hair, his touch shockingly gentle, yet possessive. His knuckles grazed her temple. "Fear smells like weakness on most," he murmured, his gaze intense, unwavering. "On you, it smells like a challenge." Before she could process the meaning behind his cryptic words, his hand dropped, and he moved with startling speed. His fingers, strong and cold, wrapped around her wrist. It wasn't a brutal grip, but it was absolute, unbreakable. The contact was a jolt of lightning, a shock that arced through her entire body. Where his skin touched hers, a strange, unwelcome heat began to bloom, a traitorous warmth that had no place in her frozen world. He held her there, his thumb stroking softly over the frantic pulse hammering just beneath her skin. He looked down at their joined hands, a king holding a captive bird, and a slow, dark satisfaction settled in his eyes. He lifted his gaze from her wrist, not to her, but to the silent, watching pack. His voice rang out, no longer a whisper, but a clear, cold decree that sealed the stone walls of the great hall around her, turning it from a shelter into a cage. She is under my protection now. No one is to speak to her. No one is to touch her. He paused, letting the weight of his command settle. His gray eyes swept over the alphas, a silent warning that promised death. Then his gaze returned to her, pinning her in place. His voice dropped once more, a possessive, final whisper that was for her and her alone. "And you," he said, his grip tightening ever so slightly on her wrist. A final, indelible brand of ownership. "You are not to leave my sight." The world was the iron grip on her wrist, and the thunder of her own blood in her ears. King Jastor Venmark did not drag her. The act was far more profound, more absolute than that. He simply moved, and she was compelled to follow, an extension of his will. Her feet stumbled on the rough-hewn stone floor, her worn boots scraping in a desperate, futile attempt to find purchase. The pack parted before them, a living corridor of wide, staring eyes and gaping mouths. She saw pity in the faces of some of the older she-wolves, fear in the eyes of the warriors, and a cruel, sharp glint of satisfaction in the gaze of Elka, the pack alpha's daughter, who had never missed an opportunity to remind Saris of her broken status. Tonight, Elka's smirk was one of pure, vicious triumph. "See what happens to the useless ones," it seemed to say. "They become toys for the powerful." Shame, hot and acidic, burned its way up Saris's throat. She tried to pull her wrist free, a single instinctive act of rebellion. It was like pulling against a mountain. Jastor didn't even seem to notice, his stride unbroken, his gaze fixed forward, but she felt the subtle shift in his grip, the way his fingers tightened not with anger, but with an unyielding certainty that was infinitely worse. It was the grip of ownership, a silent reminder that her struggles were meaningless. His scent was a storm around her, erasing the familiar smells of her home. The pine and smoke of the great hall were swallowed by the clean, cold scent of high mountain peaks, and the electric charge of ozone that clung to him like a cloak. Beneath it all was the dark, rich musk of his wolf, a scent so potent it made her own dormant wolf, the sleeping, wounded thing deep inside her, stir with a faint, ghostly whimper of pure terror. It was the instinct of prey recognizing the apex predator, a truth her body understood long before her mind could accept it. They left the warmth and light of the hall behind, plunging into the colder, shadowed corridors of the hold. The sounds of the pack faded, replaced by the rhythmic echo of Jastor's heavy boots and the frantic, light patter of her own. Two of his stone guard followed, silent as death, their presence a pair of heavy weights on the air behind her. They weren't there to guard the king from her. They were there to ensure the cage was sealed. He led her up a winding stone staircase, their path lit by sputtering torches that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, cleaner. This was the Lord's Wing, a place she hadn't set foot in since she was a child, before the tragedy that had shattered her world. The door at the top of the stairs was thick oak banded with black iron. Jastor pushed it open without ceremony and pulled her inside. The chamber was the largest she had ever seen. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire crackling within, its flames casting a sullen red glow over the room. Thick bear and wolf pelts were strewn across the floor and draped over a heavy carved bed. On a large table, maps were spread out, held down by daggers and polished stones, depicting the vast, sprawling territories of the north. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and him. His scent had already permeated the space, marking it as his own. The door swung shut behind them with a heavy, final thud, plunging the room into a deeper quiet. The stone guard remained outside. They were alone. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise of the hall. For a long moment he simply stood there, his back to the door, still holding her wrist, his immense frame blocking the only exit. The firelight played over the scars on his face, making them seem like canyons in the rugged landscape of his skin. His gray eyes were fixed on her, no longer absorbing the light, but seeming to emit a cold, flat luminescence of their own. Slowly, deliberately, he released her. Her wrist fell to her side, tingling and cold where his hand had been. A faint red mark bloomed on her pale skin, the imprint of his fingers. She instinctively wrapped her other hand around the spot. A futile gesture of protection. She stumbled back a step, then another, until the backs of her legs hit the edge of the map table. She could go no further. She was trapped. He didn't move towards her. He watched her retreat with a dispassionate curiosity, the way a wolf might watch a cornered rabbit, assessing its fear, its fight, its inevitable surrender. He unclasped the heavy, fur-lined cloak from his shoulders and let it fall. It landed on the floor with a soft, heavy sound, like a sigh. Beneath it, he wore simple black leather and wool, practical and severe, doing nothing to hide the sheer breadth of his shoulders or the coiled power in his limbs. He was a king who wore his power not in jewels or crowns, but in his very being. "You have been a ghost in this pack for 5 years," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep within the earth. "You sit by the fire but do not feel its warmth. You are present at the feasts, but do not taste the meat. You live, but you do not participate in life." His perception was a physical blow. He had seen it all. In the single hour he had been in the hall, he had seen the entirety of her miserable existence. The shame she felt was so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. She found her voice, a broken, reedy thing. "My life is my own." A corner of his mouth tilted in a semblance of a smile, but it held no warmth. It was a sharp, predatory thing. "Nothing in my kingdom is truly your own, girl. Not the land, not the kill, and not your life. It all belongs to the North, and the North belongs to me." He took a step towards her, and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the table's edge. He stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I do not beat females," he said, his tone clipped, as if the very idea was an insult to his own code. "My presence is threat enough." He was right. His proximity was a form of suffocation. She could feel the heat of him, smell the power on him, feel his will pressing down on her. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the question torn from the deepest part of her terror. He began to pace, moving with that same lethal, fluid grace she'd seen in the hall. He prowled the length of the room, his gaze never leaving her, his presence filling every dark corner. "I want what is owed," he said, stopping near the hearth. He stared into the flames, his profile hard and unforgiving in the flickering light. The Northern Fang is a powerful pack, but it grows insular, complacent. Its alpha, your alpha, thinks his borders are his own private kingdom. He forgets who sits on the winter throne. He turned his head, and his gray eyes pinned her again. Bonds are the chains that hold a kingdom together. Blood ties, mating vows. For 10 years, the Northern Fang has offered no daughter of rank to the Central Packs. No alliances. They hoard their strength. It is a slight I have overlooked for too long. Understanding dawned, cold and horrifying. This wasn't about her. Not really. She was a message, a political tool, a pawn in a game of power she couldn't begin to comprehend. He wasn't just claiming a female. He was annexing a territory, one body at a time. "I am barren," she lied, the word tasting like ash. It was the story the pack had told itself to make sense of her tragedy. A wolfless, broken omega, whose body had rejected the chance of new life after the trauma. It was easier than believing the fates could be so cruel. Jastor's gaze dropped to her throat, to the unblemished skin where a mate's mark should have been. A low sound vibrated in his chest, a growl of pure disbelief. "No," he said, his voice dropping, becoming dangerously soft. "You are not barren, you are empty, a house waiting for its master to return. Your first mate is dead. The bond was never sealed in blood. The thread was cut before the knot was tied." He took another step closer, his eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to peel back her skin and look directly at her soul. "They left you broken, an unclaimed vessel of a strong bloodline, left to wither. A king does not tolerate broken things in his domain." He was in front of her now, so close she could see the flecks of silver in his dark beard, the faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. He lifted a hand, and this time she didn't flinch. She was frozen, mesmerized by the terrible truth in his words. He didn't touch her skin. Instead, his finger traced the air just above her throat, a phantom touch that made her shiver violently. "He either mends them," he whispered, his voice a raw, hypnotic rasp that vibrated through her bones, "or he shatters them completely." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and glittering as shards of ice. Mends them or shatters them. It was not a choice offered to her, but a statement of his absolute power over her fate. Her breath hitched, a tiny, snagging sound in the oppressive silence of the chamber. For 5 years she had been nothing, a ghost drifting through the ruins of her own life. She had believed that in her brokenness there was a strange kind of safety. Who would bother with a shattered thing? But she had been wrong. Her very brokenness was what had drawn the predator's eye. A weakness in the herd, a vulnerability to be exploited. A spark of defiance, small and nearly extinguished, flickered in the desolate landscape of her soul. It was the last ember of the girl she had been before, the one who was meant to be a Luna, the one who had a voice. "I will not be mended," she whispered, the words tasting of rebellion and terror, "and I am already shattered." Jastor's gaze was unwavering. The firelight carved deep shadows under his cheekbones, making him look more like a death mask than a living man. "You think so?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from the very stones of the floor. "You have been chipped, scratched, but the core of you is untouched. Your bloodline is strong, your spirit, it hides, but it has not fled." He took a half step back, a calculated move that gave her the illusion of space, though she felt more trapped than ever. "What you call shattered, I call unprepared. You were a vessel waiting for a bond that never came. The vessel is still there, it only needs a new master." The cold arrogance of his words stole the air from her lungs. He spoke of her soul as if it were a piece of pottery, something to be filled and owned. He saw her not as a person, but a potential, an asset. The ember of defiance sputtered, nearly drowned by a fresh wave of despair. What hope was there against such a man? He was not a brute who could be outsmarted, nor a tyrant who could be swayed by pity. He was a force, as elemental and unfeeling as a northern gale. He turned from her then, moving to the massive chest at the foot of the bed. He lifted the heavy lid, the scent of cedar and cold wool filling the air. He pulled out a cloak, thick and dark, lined with the pelt of a shadow wolf. It was a king's garment, heavy with status and power. He held it out, not to her, but in her direction. "Put this on," he commanded. She stared at the cloak, then at him, uncomprehending. "Why?" "We are going outside." Panic, sharp and immediate, seized her. "No, I will not." He dropped the cloak onto the bed and turned to face her fully. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "That was not a request." His voice was flat, devoid of anger, but laced with a finality that was more chilling than any rage. "You will do as I say. You will walk where I walk. You will learn that your will is a whisper against the storm of mine. Now put on the cloak, or I will put it on you." She could feel the truth of his threat in her very bones. She imagined his hands on her, forcing the heavy garment over her shoulders, and the thought was so violating it made her physically recoil. Her hands trembled as she moved toward the bed, her legs unsteady. The fur was impossibly soft and cold against her fingertips. The cloak itself was immensely heavy. As she pulled it around her shoulders, his scent rose from the fabric, ozone, pine, and the dark musk of his wolf. It enveloped her, a possessive, suffocating blanket. It felt like a chain, a collar, another mark of his ownership. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she fumbled with the heavy silver clasp at the throat. Once it was fastened, he gave a curt nod of approval and strode to the door, pulling it open. The 2 stone guards stood outside, impassive as statues. Jastor inclined his head, a silent dismissal. They bowed and retreated down the corridor, their footsteps fading into silence. The king waited, holding the door, his eyes fixed on her. There was no escape. Taking a shuddering breath that was more his scent than air, she walked past him, careful not to brush against his body, and stepped into the cold, empty corridor. He led her not back down to the great hall, but through a series of unfamiliar passages, and down a narrow, spiraling stairwell that ended at a small, iron-banded postern gate. The air was damp, and smelled of cold stone and moss. He drew a heavy iron key from his belt, the sound of the lock turning echoing loudly in the enclosed space. The gate groaned open, revealing the night. The cold hit her first, a clean, sharp shock to her system after the stuffy heat of the hold. The hunter's moon was high and bright, bathing the world in ethereal silver and inky black. A thin layer of frost crunched under their feet, glittering like scattered diamonds. They were behind the main hall, in a small, enclosed courtyard that opened onto the edge of the great northern pines. The forest stood as a solid wall of darkness, its silence immense and watchful. Jastor didn't speak. He simply began to walk, his long strides eating up the ground, forcing her into a near trot to keep up. He moved toward the trees, his dark form a shadow against the moonlit snow. The heavy cloak he'd given her, which had felt like a cage indoors, was now a welcome shield against the biting wind that whispered through the pines. They entered the forest, and the world changed. The open moonlight was gone, replaced by a filtered, ghostly twilight that fell in slivers through the dense canopy of branches. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the clean smell of frost. The silence here was different from the silence in the king's chamber. This was the ancient silence of the woods, a living quiet that was full of unseen things. Saris's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had always loved the forest. It was where she had met Liam, her lost mate. They had spent hours running beneath these same trees, their laughter echoing in the green shadows. But now, walking beside this formidable, silent king, the forest felt alien and threatening. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a nocturnal creature, sent a jolt of fear through her. They walked for what felt like an eternity. He seemed to have no destination, merely moving deeper and deeper into the dark heart of the woods. He moved with an unnerving confidence, his steps sure and silent on the forest floor, while she stumbled over roots and rocks, her breath pluming in white clouds in front of her. Finally, he stopped in a small clearing, where a break in the canopy allowed the full, cold light of the moon to pour down, turning the frosted ground into a silver stage. He stood in the center of it, a towering silhouette, and turned to face her. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that was perfectly at home in the deep quiet of the woods. "Feel what?" she asked, her voice tight with suspicion and fear. "The power here, the old magic. This is not a land of men, Saris. This is a land of wolves. Your pack has forgotten that. They build their stone walls, light their fires, and pretend the wild has been tamed." He took a step towards her. "But it is always here, waiting. It answers to strength. It answers to a true alpha." His gray eyes seemed to glow in the moonlight, holding a feral light she hadn't seen indoors. His wolf was closer to the surface here, a palpable presence that raised the fine hairs on her arms. Her own wolf, the dormant, sleeping creature inside her, stirred again, not with fear this time, but with a strange, aching resonance. It was a call of the wild she had not felt in 5 long years. "My pack is strong," she said, a reflexive defense of the only home she had ever known, however cruel it had been to her. A humorless smile touched his lips. "Your pack is a tooth that has grown dull. It needs sharpening." Before she could form a reply, a sound cut through the silence. The sharp snap of a heavy branch, too deliberate to be an animal. Jastor's entire posture changed in an instant. The languid power became coiled, explosive tension. His head snapped in the direction of the sound, and a low growl, this one fully audible, vibrated from his chest. It was a sound of absolute lethal warning. A figure stepped out from behind a thicket of ancient pines. It was Drag, one of the pack's most brutish enforcers, a loyal dog to the pack alpha and a known tormentor of the lower ranks. His face, broad and scarred, was twisted into a sneer in the moonlight. 2 other wolves flanked him, their expressions equally hostile. "King Jastor," Drag sneered, his voice rough. He deliberately let his gaze slide over to Saris, dismissing her with a look of utter contempt. "This is Northern Fang territory. Our alpha does not take kindly to his property, being walked in the woods without his permission, especially not damaged goods like this one." The insult was a physical blow. Saris flinched, shame and anger warring within her. Jastor did not look at her. His attention was fixed solely on the 3 wolves, his body perfectly still, yet radiating a pressure that made the very air seem to warp around him. "Your alpha is my subject," Jaster said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "And this female is under my protection. You will return to your hold and tell your alpha that if he wishes to question my movements, he can do so himself, and that I will expect him on his knees." Drag laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The king has been in the south too long. He forgets the laws of the north. An unclaimed Omega belongs to the pack, not to a visiting tyrant." He took a foolish, aggressive step forward. "We're taking her back." Jastor moved. It was not a step or a lunge. He simply blurred, crossing the 10 feet between them in less than a heartbeat. There was a sickening, wet crunch of bone, and Drag let out a choked scream as Jastor's hand shot out, seizing the man's extended arm and shattering the elbow with a single brutal twist. Drag dropped to his knees, howling. The other 2 wolves froze, their bravado evaporating into pure animal terror. But the king wasn't finished. His eyes were no longer gray. They were glowing with the pale, predatory light of his wolf. The air around him shimmered as the change fought for release. He leaned down, his face inches from the whimpering Drag, and his voice was a guttural snarl, more beast than man. "She is not the pack's. She is not yours. She is mine." He shoved Drag's ruined arm back at him and straightened up, turning his incandescent gaze on the other 2, who immediately scrambled backward, tripping over themselves to flee into the darkness. He let them go. He turned his back on the pathetic, sobbing form of Drag on the ground. And then he turned to her. He stalked toward her, the predator fully unleashed. The scent of his rage and dominance was a tidal wave, crashing over her, stealing her breath. She was paralyzed, not by fear alone, but by a terrifying, primal awe. This was the true Alpha King, the wolf that ruled the north. He didn't stop until he was caging her against the trunk of a massive pine, his hands planting on the bark on either side of her head. His face was so close she could feel the heat of his breath, see the wolf staring out from behind his eyes. He was breathing heavily, the struggle for control, a visible war in the tense lines of his body. He lowered his head and she squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for a blow, a bite, anything. But his mouth did not touch her. Instead, he buried his face in the curve of her neck and shoulder, his beard rough against her sensitive skin. He inhaled, a deep, shuddering breath, drawing her scent into his lungs, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to his human form. His scent, thick with rage, possession, and the ozone of a lightning strike, flooded her senses. He wasn't just smelling her, he was marking her, saturating her with his own powerful essence, branding her in a way far more permanent than a touch or a bite. It was a primal declaration, a silent, soul-deep claim made in the heart of the ancient woods, witnessed only by the moon and a broken man. The world was the rough bark of the pine tree digging into her back, and the thunderous, ragged sound of the king's breathing in her ear. Sarah stood frozen, a mouse in the shadow of a hawk, every muscle locked in a paralysis that was beyond mere fear. It was awe. It was the primal, instinctual submission of a lesser creature in the face of absolute, untamed power. His scent was a thick, intoxicating cloud, seeping into her skin, her hair, the very wool of the cloak he had given her. It was the smell of dominance, of rage barely leashed, and beneath it all, a strange, dark note of something that felt terrifyingly like satisfaction. He was marking her, not with tooth and claw, but with the very essence of his being, a claim so profound it bypassed the physical and went straight for the soul. Her own dormant wolf, the ghost she had carried for 5 years, was no longer whimpering. It was awake. It was crouched in the deepest part of her, not in terror, but in a state of hyper-awareness, its head raised, its senses straining, recognizing the presence of a power it had never known. It was the call of the apex, the undeniable pull of a true Alpha King, and it terrified her more than the violence she had just witnessed. Slowly, as if fighting against immense chains, Jaster lifted his head. The feral, incandescent light in his eyes was receding, banked like coals, but the gray that replaced it was harder, colder, and more focused than before. He was still breathing harshly, his broad chest rising and falling, the battle for control a visible war fought in the tense lines of his body. He stared down at her, his gaze sweeping over her face, her throat, as if searching for the mark he had just left, the invisible brand of his scent. "Now you understand," he said, his voice a raw, guttural rasp. It was not a question, it was a conclusion. She couldn't find her voice. She could only stare back at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She understood nothing, and yet she understood everything. She understood that her life, the quiet, miserable existence she had curated in the shadows, was over. The game had changed, and she was no longer a forgotten piece off the board. She was the board, the territory over which a war was about to be fought. He pushed away from the tree, the sudden absence of his body heat, leaving her skin prickling with cold. He straightened to his full, formidable height, his silhouette blocking out the moon. He looked toward the path Drag and his cronies had taken, his expression one of disdain. "The pups have run back to their sire," he said, his voice regaining its cold, regal composure. "Alpha Gregor will be waiting. He will posture. He will object. He will be reminded of his place." He turned his gaze back to her, and it was sharp enough to strip flesh from bone. "And you will stand by my side while he learns his lesson. You will not flinch. You will not look away. You are mine now, and my property does not show weakness." The word, property, was a slap. It stung, bringing a hot flush of shame to her cheeks, but it also clarified everything. He was not her protector, not truly. He was her new owner. The cage had just changed its shape, grown larger and infinitely more dangerous. Without another word, he began the walk back toward the hold. She hesitated for only a second, her feet frozen to the frost-covered ground. His voice came back, sharp and impatient, without him even turning to look at her. "Come." It was the same tone one would use with a disobedient hound. Swallowing the bitter lump of pride in her throat, she followed. The walk back was a silent torment. Every step she took was a step further away from the life she knew and deeper into his world. The heavy cloak, saturated now with his powerful scent, felt like a judgment. She could feel it clinging to her, a ghostly second skin that would announce his claim to any wolf she passed. The thought of facing the pack, of standing before Alpha Gregor marked so blatantly, made her stomach churn with a nauseous dread. As they drew closer to the hold, the sounds of an agitated pack reached them. Low growls, anxious murmurs, the sharp bark of commands. The news had spread like wildfire. They emerged from the tree line into the courtyard, and the postern gate stood open, spilling a rectangle of yellow torchlight onto the snow. Standing in that light, barring their way, was Alpha Gregor himself. He was a big man, broad and grizzled, his authority built on years of brute strength and intimidation. But standing before Jaster Venmark, he looked diminished, like a common wolf facing a dire wolf of legend. His face was a mask of thunderous fury, his eyes burning with a rage that was equal parts indignation and fear. He was flanked by 10 of his best warriors, their hands resting on the hilts of their daggers, their postures aggressive. "Venmark," Gregor snarled, his voice a low rumble. He did not call him king. It was a deliberate, calculated insult. "You trespass on my lands and steal my people. You have forgotten the old ways." Jaster came to a halt, placing himself slightly in front of Saris, a subtle but clear assertion of his position. He looked at Gregor and his warriors with an air of profound boredom, as if they were a mild inconvenience he was forced to address. "I have forgotten nothing, Gregor," Jastor replied, his voice calm, yet carrying an edge of honed steel that cut through the Alpha's bluster. "It is you who have forgotten your oath. You forget that your lands are mine. Your people are mine. Your very life is forfeit to my will. You have been allowed to rule this territory as a steward, a privilege you seem to have mistaken for a right." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. The warriors bristled, their hands tightening on their weapons. "As for this female," Jaster continued, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous, "she is not yours to be stolen. She is of the Dunlore line, a bloodline sworn to the Winter Throne, long before your whelping. She was left unclaimed, unbroken, a resource left to rot through your neglect. I am not stealing, I am salvaging." Gregor's face purpled with rage. He took a step forward, his chest puffed out. "She is an omega of this pack. Her fate is for me to decide." He finally looked at Ceres, and his gaze was filled with a venomous contempt. This is what you choose to champion? A barren, wolfless ghost? You shame yourself, and you shame the North." Before Ceres could flinch, before the familiar shame could claim her, Jastor moved. It was not the blur of speed he'd used on Drag. but a single powerful stride that closed half the distance between them. "You will not speak of her again," he commanded, and the sheer force of his will was a physical blow. The air crackled with his power. Gregor actually stumbled back a step, his eyes wide, his bravado finally cracking under the pressure of Jaster's raw aura. "Her worth is not for you to judge. Her status is not for you to name. Her fate is now mine to command. This is my decree." He drew himself up to his full, intimidating height, and his voice rose, ringing out across the courtyard, carrying back into the now silent great hall, where the rest of the pack was listening with bated breath. "The Northern Fang has grown arrogant, and its bond to the crown has weakened. This ends tonight, as a sign of renewed fealty, as a price for your years of insolence, and as my right as your king, I claim Cerys of the Dunlore line. She is no longer an Omega of this pack. She is my ward, under my direct protection. Her bloodline is now bound to mine. Any insult to her is a challenge to me. Any harm that befalls her will be answered with the utter annihilation of this hold, from its foundations to its alpha." Silence. A profound, stunned silence that was heavier and more absolute than any sound. The warriors stared, their aggression gone, replaced by shock and fear. Gregor stood as if turned to stone, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a challenge, a fight for dominance. He had not expected this. A formal political claiming that stripped him of his authority over Cerys and turned her into a symbol of his own subjugation. It was a masterful, devastating move that left him no recourse but submission or death. Jaster held the silence for a long, cold moment, letting his decree settle like a shroud over the pack. Then, with the battle won, he turned. Not to Gregor, not to the warriors, but to her. He moved to her side, his movements now calm and deliberate. The storm was gone, replaced by the unnerving certainty of a king who had just redrawn the map of his kingdom. The eyes of the entire world were on them. She could feel them, hundreds of pairs of eyes, burning into her. He stopped in front of her, so close she could see the frost clinging to the edges of his dark beard. He looked down at her, his gray eyes unreadable. But for the first time, she felt like he was seeing her, not the pawn, not the bloodline, but the terrified woman standing before him. His hand, calloused and impossibly large, came up. She thought he might touch her face, a gesture of possession for the crowd, but he didn't. Instead, his fingers went to the heavy silver clasp of the cloak at her throat. With a slow, precise movement, he adjusted it, settling the heavy fur more comfortably on her shoulders. It was a small, strangely intimate gesture, a quiet act of care in the midst of a brutal display of power. It sent a tremor of confusion through her that was more unsettling than his rage had been. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur meant only for her, a final, sealing command that echoed the pronouncement he had just made to the world. "It is done," he whispered, his breath warm against her cold cheek. "From this night forward, you answer to no one but me." He had not mended her. He had not shattered her. He had reforged her into a symbol, a weapon, and its hilt was now held firmly, irrevocably, in his hand. The walk back to the great hall was a journey through a landscape of altered reality. When she had left, she was a ghost, invisible in her shame. Now returning at the king's side, she was the most solid, most scrutinized thing in the entire hold. As they stepped over the threshold, a wave of silence rolled back from them, more profound and suffocating than before. Every face turned in their direction, every pair of eyes, curious, resentful, fearful, fixed upon her. She was no longer Cerys Dunlore, the broken Omega. She was a symbol. She was the king's decree made flesh. She could feel their thoughts, a barrage of silent questions and judgments. They weren't looking at her with pity now. They were looking at her with a dangerous cocktail of awe and hatred. She was the reason their alpha had been humbled. She was the living proof of their pack's subjugation. In their eyes, she had gone from being a nobody to being a traitor, a prize claimed by an invading power. She saw Elka, the pack alpha's daughter, standing near the high table, her face a mask of pale, venomous fury. The satisfaction was gone, replaced by a look of such pure loathing that Cerys felt it like a physical chill. Jastor seemed oblivious to the thick, hostile atmosphere. He moved through the hall as if he were walking through his own private throne room, his gaze fixed forward, his presence an undeniable assertion of his right to be there. He did not touch her, yet she felt tethered to him, trapped in the gravitational pull of his power. He led her not to the hearth where she had hidden before, but directly toward the high table, the seat of power in the pack. He stopped before the Alpha's great chair, the one carved with the snarling wolf's head of Gregor's line. For a moment, she thought he would sit in it, the ultimate act of dominance. Instead, he simply rested a hand on its high back, a gesture of casual ownership, and turned his gaze upon the silent, watching pack. "The night grows late," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly to every corner of the hall. "Your Alpha has things to contemplate, as do you all. My business here is concluded for the evening." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over them one last time before it settled, briefly, on the pale face of Alpha Gregor, who stood frozen in the entryway. "Fealty is not a suggestion, it is the air you breathe." With that final chilling pronouncement, he turned and gestured toward the corridor leading to the Lord's wing. He expected her to precede him. Her feet felt like lead, to walk away from her pack, from the only life she had ever known, and follow him. It was a final public act of severance. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that was filled with the sense of her hostile home, she turned her back on them all and walked. She did not look back. She could feel their eyes on her, 1,000 tiny daggers aimed at her spine. Back. In the king's chamber, the silence that fell was different from before. The air of immediate, predatory threat had been replaced by something heavier, more complex. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room seem even larger and her feel even smaller. Jastor shut the heavy oak door, the sound of the latch clicking into place, echoing the sound of her cage being locked. He walked past her to the table where a flagon of wine and a single goblet sat. He poured, the dark red liquid splashing into the silver. He didn't offer her any. He drained the goblet in one long, slow draught, his throat working. When he set it down, the sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Why?" The word escaped her before she could stop it. It was a thin, reedy sound, but it was her own. He turned to face her, one dark eyebrow raised slightly. He didn't pretend not to understand. "I already told you, bonds hold the kingdom together. Your pack was becoming a rogue state in all but name. I used the tool that was available to me." "A tool?" The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. "I am a person, not a hammer to beat my Alpha into submission." A flicker of something, was it amusement, respect, crossed his stern features. "Everything is a tool to a king, girl. A sword, a treaty, a life. You are a Dunlore. Your blood carries weight. Your public binding to me reminds Gregor, and every other Alpha north of the Black River, that even the most forgotten lines ultimately belong to the crown." He began to unbuckle the leather vambraces on his forearms, his movements economical and precise. As he pulled off the one on his left arm, she saw a dark wet stain on the sleeve of his tunic beneath it, near the elbow. Blood. Drag's attack, for all its clumsiness, had not been entirely without effect. One of the other wolves must have gotten a lucky strike with a dagger in the blur of motion. Jastor glanced at the wound with an air of detached annoyance. It was a shallow gash, but long, bleeding sluggishly. He walked over to a leather satchel resting on the chest and pulled out a small clay pot and a roll of clean linen. "I am not your tool," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength from the anger that was finally beginning to burn through the fog of her fear. "I will not be used." He opened the pot, and the sharp, clean scent of a healing salve, willow herb and moss, filled the air. He ignored her outburst, his attention focused on the task at hand. "Your consent is not a factor in this," he said, his voice flat. "You think you have a choice. You think yes or no still belong to you. They do not. You had a choice 5 years ago, perhaps, to live or to die with your chosen mate. You chose to live, and life in the North always eventually comes with a price." His words were cruel, a deliberate strike at the heart of her deepest grief. The memory of Liam's face, of his laughter, of his hand in hers, rose up, and the pain was so sharp, so fresh, it stole her breath. Tears pricked at the backs of her eyes, hot and shameful. She would not cry in front of him. She would not. He dipped his fingers into the salve and began to apply it to the cut, his face set in grim lines, but his left arm was his shield arm, and the angle was awkward. He winced, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscle in his jaw, as his probing fingers aggravated the wound. And then something shifted inside her. An instinct she thought had died with Liam. The instinct to heal, to mend, before she could think, before she could weigh the consequences. She crossed the room in 3 short steps. "You're doing it wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You'll bruise the flesh." He froze, his fingers hovering over the gash, and looked up at her. His gray eyes were wide with genuine surprise. For the first time since he'd arrived, she had done something that he had not anticipated. The air between them thickened, charged with a new and uncertain current. He stared at her, his gaze intense, searching. It felt as if he were looking past her face, past her fear, and seeing something deep inside her that no one else had seen for years. Slowly, deliberately, he held his arm out to her. It was not a command. It was a concession, an offering, a test. Her hands trembled as she took a strip of linen from the roll. She tore it cleanly, her fingers remembering the familiar motions of preparing a bandage. She dipped the cloth into the pot of salve, her movements gentle. Kneeling before him where he sat on the edge of the chest, she took his arm. His skin was hot beneath her cool fingers. The muscles were like banded steel, covered in a fine tracery of old silvery scars. His sheer physicality was overwhelming up close. She focused on the task, on the clean line of the cut, the dark welling of blood. She cleaned the wound with a practiced efficiency, her touch light but sure. He remained utterly still, his breathing the only sound in the room besides the crackle of the fire. He watched her, his gaze a heavy weight on the top of her bowed head. As she worked, her eyes traced the path of an old scar, a jagged, ugly thing that ran from his wrist halfway to his elbow. It was the kind of wound left by a cursed blade, one that had been meant to cripple. "This one," she found herself whispering, her finger hovering over the ancient mark. "It looks like it was meant to take your hand." He was silent for a long moment. She thought he would not answer, that he would retreat back behind his wall of command. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, laced with the memory of old pain. "It was," he said, "from a rogue alpha in the sunken fens. He thought a king who couldn't wield a sword was no king at all." He paused. "I proved him wrong. I beat him to death with my shield, with this arm." She looked up and his gray eyes were fixed on her, but they were seeing something else. "A battlefield, a memory. He gave me this scar," Jastor murmured, his gaze dropping to the wound she was tending. "I gave his pack to the crows. A king must be willing to trade his own blood for the blood of his enemies. It is the first and last lesson of the crown." In that moment, he was not just a tyrant who had stolen her life. He was a man, scarred and burdened, who ruled a savage land by savage means. The crown was not a jewel he wore. It was a weight, a collection of scars, both visible and not. An unexpected, unwanted sliver of understanding pierced her heart. She finished her work, tying the bandage with a neat, firm knot. Her fingers brushed against his skin one last time, and a strange jolt, a spark of warmth, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back as if burned. He did not pull away. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. She rose to her feet, the spell of the moment broken. She was the captive again. He was the king. He stood up, flexing his bandaged arm. "You have a healer's touch." It was a simple statement of fact, yet it felt like more. He looked at the small, pallet-like bed in the corner of the room, a simple cot meant for a servant or a squire. Then he looked at the massive, fur-draped bed that was his. "You will sleep there," he said, nodding toward his own bed. She stared at him, aghast. "No, I will not." "I do not share my bed," he stated, his voice turning to ice, cutting off her panicked assumption. "And I will not have my ward sleeping on the floor like a dog. You will sleep in the bed. I will take the chair by the fire." It was an order, but it was also a strange, incomprehensible act of consideration. He was a storm of contradictions, a monster with moments of startling honor. She was so tired, so emotionally battered, that she didn't have the strength to argue. Numbly, she walked to the massive bed, and without removing even her boots, she lay down on top of the furs, pulling the heavy cloak he had given her over her body. It was still saturated with his scent, but now, mixed with the smell of the healing salve, and the memory of his shared confidence. It was no longer just the scent of a captor. It was something far more complicated. She lay there, her back to him, listening to the sounds of him settling into the large chair by the fire. She expected to lie awake all night, terrified and alert. But the weight of the cloak, the warmth of the furs, and the sheer bone-deep exhaustion of the night pulled her under. Just as she was drifting into a restless sleep, his voice cut through the darkness, low and final. "Sleep," he commanded softly. "You are a weapon that needs to be sharp, and tomorrow your training begins." Saris awoke with a gasp, her body jerking from a dream of falling. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a sharp, clean coldness filled her senses. She was warm, cocooned in a mountain of heavy furs. As her eyes adjusted to the pre-dawn gloom, the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She was in the king's bed. The memory of the previous night, the humiliation, the violence, the strange, unsettling moment of connection, rushed back, leaving a sour taste in her mouth. She turned her head slowly. The great chair by the hearth was empty. The fire had burned down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers that cast a weak, pulsing light on the stone floor. For a wild, hopeful second, she thought he was gone. Then she saw him. He was standing by the chamber's single narrow window, a tall, dark silhouette against the pale, bruised purple of the coming dawn. He was already dressed, not in the furs and leathers of a king holding court, but in the severe, practical garb of a warrior: dark wool tunic, reinforced leather trousers, and heavy boots. He was perfectly still, staring out at the snow-covered pines, but his stillness was not restful. It was the alert, coiled stillness of a wolf on the hunt, a predator waiting for the world to awaken so it could impose its will upon it. He hadn't slept. She knew it with a bone-deep certainty. He had watched over the room, over her, all night. The thought was both terrifying and, in a way she refused to acknowledge, strangely steadying. The floorboards creaked as she sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. His head turned instantly, his gray eyes locking onto hers. Across the dim room, there was no greeting, no softening of his stern expression. "On your feet," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated with impatience. "The dawn does not wait for the weak." He tossed a bundle onto the foot of the bed. It was a set of clothes, practical and well-made, but clearly for a man. A simple wool tunic, sturdy trousers, and soft leather boots that looked like they might, miraculously, be close to her size. There was also a water skin and a small hard loaf of bread. "Dress, eat, we leave in 10 minutes. "Leave?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Leave for where?" "Your training begins," he said, as if that explained everything. He turned back to the window, his posture a clear dismissal. The conversation was over. There was no modesty, no privacy to be had. With clumsy, cold fingers, she shed her worn tunic and skirt, the clothes of the Omega she had been, and pulled on the new garments. They were too large, but they were warm and offered a freedom of movement her old clothes never had. The boots were snug, lined with soft rabbit fur. She ate half the bread, forcing the dry crumbs down her throat, and drank from the water skin. The water was shockingly cold, a jolt that cleared the last of the sleep from her mind. As she finished, he turned from the window. He strode toward her, his presence seeming to shrink the large chamber. He stopped before her and looked her over, his gaze clinical and assessing, like a smith examining a blade. He noted the way the clothes hung on her small frame, the paleness of her face, the defiant tilt of her chin. "It will have to do," he grumbled, more to himself than to her. He gestured to the door. "Let's go." He led her out of the chamber and down the same winding postern stairwell as the night before, avoiding the main halls of the hold. The sun had not yet risen, and the world was bathed in a cold blue-gray light. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, blanketing the courtyard in a pristine, unbroken sheet of white. The air was so cold it stung her lungs, each breath a painful, sharp intake. Jastor plunged into the snow without hesitation, his long strides breaking the perfect surface. He moved toward the forest, and she had no choice but to follow in the deep tracks he left behind. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice lost in the vast silence. "To find out what you are made of." He threw back over his shoulder, He set a punishing pace. It was not a walk, but a relentless forward march. Within minutes, they were deep among the pines, the hold lost to sight behind them. There was no path. He moved through the trees as if they were his own great hall, his inner compass fixed on some unseen destination. For the first hour, Sarah struggled to keep up, her shorter legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping through the wool of her clothes, numbing her fingers and toes. But Jastor never slowed, never looked back. It wasn't just a journey, it was a test. He was trying to break her. The sun rose, a pale, anemic disk in a sky the color of iron. Its light offered no warmth. They climbed, the ground sloping steeply upwards, forcing her to use her hands to pull herself up over frozen rocks and through thick, snow-laden undergrowth. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her breath came in ragged, painful sobs. A part of her, the small, spiteful part that had survived the last 5 years, wanted to give up, to simply collapse into the snow and let him leave her behind. But a deeper, older instinct, the stubborn pride of the Dunlor line, refused to let her. She would not give him the satisfaction. She would not be weak. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, he stopped. They were on a high, windswept ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The northern Fang hold was a tiny, toy-like cluster of buildings far below, a plume of smoke rising from its central hearth. The sheer scale of the wilderness around them was breathtaking and terrifying. Mountains like broken teeth sawed at the horizon, their peaks shrouded in mist. The great northern forest stretched out below them like a dark green sea. Saris bent over, her hands on her knees, gasping for breath, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. Her entire body ached with a deep, shuddering fatigue. Jastor stood at the edge of the ridge, his back to her, seemingly unaffected by the grueling climb. He surveyed the vast expanse of his kingdom, a solitary, powerful figure against the unforgiving landscape. "Look," he commanded without turning. "This is what you have been hiding from. This is the world. It is vast and it is merciless. It does not care for your grief. It does not care for your broken heart. It rewards only strength. It culls only the weak." He turned to face her, his gray eyes as cold and hard as the rocks beneath their feet. "Your pack pitied you. They coddled your weakness and allowed you to become a ghost. Pity is a poison, Saris. It rots the soul. I will not pity you. I will make you strong, or I will see you break completely." Anger, hot and sharp, flared through her exhaustion. "You know nothing of my grief," she spat, her voice raw. "I know everything of grief," he countered, his voice dropping, becoming a low, dangerous thing. "I know what it is to watch the life you have built burn to ash. I know what it is to hold the one you are sworn to protect as they draw their last breath." A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of an ancient, profound pain that was gone as quickly as it came. He had not been speaking of her. He had been speaking of himself. Before she could process this startling glimpse beneath his iron shell, his expression hardened again. But grief is a fire. You can let it consume you, or you can forge yourself in its flames. You chose to be consumed. Today, you learn to be the forge. He pointed down a steep, treacherous-looking slope on the other side of the ridge. "We go down, and you will not fall behind." He started down the slope without another word, his movements sure-footed and swift. Saris watched him go, a wave of despair washing over her. She couldn't do it. Her body had nothing left to give. But then she saw the look on his face again in her mind's eye, that flash of his own buried sorrow. He was a monster, a tyrant, a brute, but he was a monster who had been forged in his own fire. The thought didn't comfort her, but it intrigued her. It gave her a reason to take the first trembling step down the slope. The descent was worse than the climb. Loose rocks and icy patches made every step a gamble. She fell twice, her hands and knees scraped raw by the frozen ground. Jastor never stopped, never offered a hand. He simply waited at the bottom of a ravine, his arms crossed over his chest, his face an unreadable mask of stone. By the time she reached him, she was trembling with cold and exhaustion, her pride in tatters. He just nodded, as if she had met some base-level expectation, and started moving again. They were in a darker, older part of the forest now. The pines were immense, their ancient branches blocking out most of the sky, creating a perpetual twilight. The air was still and heavy, and the silence was absolute. An uneasy feeling prickled at the back of Saris's neck. This place felt wrong. It felt hungry. Suddenly, Jaster stopped dead. He didn't turn. He just raised a hand, a silent command for her to halt. He sniffed the air, his head tilted, his entire body going rigid with a focused, predatory intensity. "What is it?" she whispered. "Blood," he growled, the word a vibration in his chest. "And desperation." And then she smelled it too, the coppery tang of fresh blood, sharp and metallic on the cold air, and beneath it, a sour, rancid scent of madness and decay. A rogue. A figure stumbled out from behind a massive, moss-covered boulder 100 yards ahead. It was a shifter, caught halfway between man and wolf. His form was twisted, his spine hunched, and his limbs were elongated and wrong. Patches of mangy fur clung to his gray skin, and his eyes were a burning, feverish yellow, devoid of all reason. He was gaunt, starving, and his lips were pulled back from his yellowed teeth in a permanent, drooling snarl. This was what happened to a wolf who lost his pack, his mate, his mind. This was a walking death. Saris froze, her blood turning to ice water in her veins. The sight of him, the scent of him, it was a key turning in a lock deep inside her. It threw her back 5 years to a moonlit clearing and the sound of Liam's scream. The rogues that had killed him had looked just like this one, twisted, mad. The rogue saw them. A guttural, rattling growl tore from its throat. It wasn't a challenge. It was the mindless rage of a cornered, rabid animal. It lowered its head and charged. Saris's body betrayed her. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her mind was a white-hot scream of pure, paralyzing terror. Liam's face, his eyes wide with shock and pain, flashed before her. Jaster didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shift. He simply moved to stand in front of her, a solid wall of fury between her and the charging nightmare. As the rogue closed the distance, its claws tearing at the frozen earth, Jaster let out a roar. It was not a human sound. It was the sound of a mountain splitting in two, the roar of a primal god of the wild. It was a sound of such absolute, earth-shattering dominance that the rogue, mindless and mad, actually skidded to a halt, its charge broken by sheer instinctual terror. It whimpered, a high, pathetic sound, and tried to back away. "The blood moon calls for its due," Jaster snarled, his voice a guttural promise of death. "And your corrupted blood will serve as payment." He moved, a blur of shadow and violence. He met the rogue's frantic, clumsy attack with brutal efficiency. There was the sickening crack of bone as he shattered its arm, the wet tear of flesh as his fingers, hard as iron talons, found its throat. The fight was over in seconds. The rogue lay in a crumpled, broken heap in the snow, its mad yellow eyes staring sightlessly at the dark canopy above. Jastor stood over the body, his chest heaving, the wolf shimmering just beneath his skin. The scent of his violent victory, of blood and adrenaline and righteous fury, filled the clearing. He turned, and his eyes, glowing with a faint residual wolf light, found hers. He saw her, saw the tears streaming down her face, saw the stark, abject terror that held her in its grip. His fury vanished, replaced by a dark, possessive anger aimed not at her, but at the memory that had broken her. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, and his hands came up, gripping her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, anchoring. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice raw. He gave her a small shake. "He is dead. The memory cannot hurt you. I am here." She stared up at him, her vision blurred by tears, seeing not a king or a tyrant, but a force of nature that had just shielded her from her own worst nightmare. He had not let it touch her. He had stood between her and the past. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers. His breath was warm against her icy skin. "This," he whispered, his voice intense, vibrating through her bones. "This fear, this is the poison. This is the ghost that keeps your wolf caged." He pulled back, his hands still gripping her, his gray eyes burning into hers with a new, terrifying purpose. "This training is not about making your body strong, Saris. It is about making your soul remember how to fight." He stared at her, his gaze unwavering, as he delivered the final, impossible pronouncement. "We are not training you. We are hunting for your wolf, and I will drag it, screaming, back into the light." His words were a physical violation, a promise to tear into the scarred-over wound she had protected for 5 years. "My wolf is dead," she choked out, the words raw and ragged, torn from the deepest part of her. She shoved against his hands, a futile, desperate gesture. "She died with him. What you are hunting is a grave." Jastor's grip on her shoulders tightened. Not with anger, but with an unyielding, absolute certainty that was far more terrifying. The residual light of the wolf faded from his eyes, leaving them the cold, clear gray of a winter sky, but his intensity did not lessen. "A wolf does not die so easily," he growled, his voice a low counterpoint to the vast silence of the ancient forest. "It sleeps, it hides, it starves itself in the dark of your grief. I am merely the storm that will wake it." He released her so abruptly she stumbled back a step. He turned from the dead rogue, dismissing the corpse as if it were nothing more than a shed snakeskin, and began to walk, not back the way they came, but deeper into the oppressive twilight of the old-growth forest. "Stay close," he commanded over his shoulder. "There is more than one hungry ghost in these woods." Rage, pure and hot, was a welcome relief from the icy paralysis of her fear. How dare he? How dare he speak of her loss, of her wolf, as if he had any right? How dare he drag her past back into the light and dissect it with his cold, arrogant pronouncements? For a moment, she considered running, fleeing in the opposite direction, taking her chances with the wilderness. But the image of the rogue's mindless eyes, and the memory of the swift, brutal finality with which Jastor had dispatched it, killed the thought before it could fully form. There were worse things in the woods than him. He was, for now, the more dangerous predator, and there was a grim safety in that. Clenching her jaw until it ached, she followed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of his declaration, with her own seething fury, with the unspoken promise of a confrontation that was yet to come. He led her to a place she had only heard of in the pack's oldest stories, a hollow carved into the heart of the forest, where the ancient pines gave way to a circle of monolithic, moss-covered stones that leaned in on each other like sleeping giants. In the center of the circle, a spring bubbled up from the earth, the water so cold it steamed in the frigid air, flowing over smooth, dark rocks before disappearing back into the ground. The place felt ancient, humming with a quiet, dormant power that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The air was different here, still and heavy, tasting of wet stone, deep earth, and something else, something wild and sacred. Jastor stopped in the exact center of the stone circle, next to the steaming spring. The faint light that filtered through the canopy seemed to gather here, bathing him in a ghostly, ethereal glow. He turned to face her, his expression grim, purposeful. This was his chosen battlefield. "The heart of the wood," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be absorbed by the stones around them. "The old ones say the first wolf drank from this spring. They say a shifter who has lost their way can find it again here, or be broken by what they see." He took a step toward her, closing the space between them until he was little more than an arm's length away. "Your grief is a shield, Saris. You hold the memory of your lost mate in front of you like a ward against life. You have made a shrine of your sorrow, and you have been kneeling at it for 5 years. The time for prayer is over." "You have no right," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "I have every right," he countered, his voice sharp as flint. "I claimed you. Your weakness is my weakness. Your brokenness is a flaw in my armor. I will not have it. You will face the ghost that haunts you, and you will either banish it or I will." He moved closer still, his scent, pine and winter air and the dark musk of his wolf, enveloping her, a deliberate act of olfactory dominance. It was meant to provoke, to trigger a primal response. "Tell me about him," he commanded. "The boy, Liam, tell me how he died." The name on his lips was a sacrilege. "No. Tell me," he insisted, his voice hardening, his gray eyes boring into hers, "or I will tell you. I will tell you how a boy, barely a man, stood against 2 crazed rogues, how he was too slow, too weak, how his love for you was not enough to give him the strength he needed to protect you, how his last thought was of his own failure as he bled out in the dirt." Every word was a hammer blow, striking at the foundations of the shrine she had built in her heart. He was twisting her most sacred memory into a weapon and turning it against her. A raw, guttural sound of pure anguish was torn from her throat. "Stop it!" she screamed, lunging at him. Her hands balled into fists, beating uselessly against the hard wall of his chest. "You lie! He was strong! He was brave! He saved me!" He caught her wrists, his grip like iron bands holding her fast. "He died," Jasper snarled, his face inches from hers, his own wolf rising to the surface, a dangerous, feral light kindling in his eyes. "Bravery is not a shield against claws and teeth. He died, and he left you. He left you alone and unprotected." Was that his plan? To leave his mate to be pitied and scorned by her pack for the rest of her days? A true alpha, a true mate, would have torn the world apart before allowing that. His love made you weak. His memory keeps you chained. Something inside her snapped. The grief, the rage, the 5 years of suppressed silent agony erupted in a single volcanic surge. It was a force beyond reason, beyond control. A scream of pure animal fury ripped through her, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. The world, which had been a blur of gray and green, suddenly sharpened into crystalline focus. The scent of the damp earth, the cold stone, the ozone of Jasper's power, and the faint coppery tang of the rogue's blood still clinging to him. It all crashed into her with the force of a physical blow. A wave of heat, scorching and wild, flooded her veins. And deep within the cold, silent grave she had made for her wolf, an eye flickered open. She felt it. A tremor, a ghost of a snarl vibrating in her own chest. The strength that flooded her arms was not her own. She ripped her wrists from his grasp, the force of it so unexpected that Jastor, the Alpha King himself, actually took a half step back, his eyes widening in shock. She saw her reflection in those wide, stunned gray eyes, and for a fraction of a second, the eyes that stared back were not her own familiar, sorrow-filled blue. They were gold, molten, luminous, feral gold. The eyes of her wolf. The power receded as quickly as it came, leaving her gasping, her body trembling with a violent, bone-jarring shock. The world swam, the edges of her vision turning dark. The connection, the brief, brilliant flare of her other half, was too much. The shock of feeling her wolf, of seeing through its eyes for the first time in 5 years, was like being struck by lightning. Her knees buckled. She didn't hit the ground. Jastor was there, his arms closing around her, catching her against his hard chest. He held her, his body a solid, anchoring presence in her dizzying, collapsing world. She could feel the thunder of his heart against her ear, a heavy, rapid beat. He wasn't looking at her face. His gaze was fixed on her throat, on the place where a mate's mark should be. His expression was one of intense, predatory focus, but it was mingled with a profound, almost reverent awe. He had seen it, he had felt it. He had hunted the ghost, and for one terrifying, magnificent moment, he had found it. He lowered his head, his breath warm against her ear, his voice a low, possessive rumble that was meant not for her, but for the wild thing he had just awakened. "There she is," he breathed, the words a vibration that seemed to sink directly into her soul. "I knew you were in there." He shifted his grip, one powerful arm banding around her waist, holding her securely against him. His other hand came up, his fingers calloused and surprisingly gentle, brushing the hair back from her temple. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, a gesture of ownership so profound it made her tremble. "This changes nothing," he murmured, his voice a dark velvet promise. "And it changes everything." He pulled back just enough to look down into her dazed eyes, and the cold, regal mask of the king was gone, replaced by the raw, possessive focus of the wolf. "The training is over, Uka," he whispered, a dark satisfaction curling the edge of his lips. "Now the claiming begins." A year had passed, one full turn of the seasons, each leaving its mark, not on the ancient stones of the winter throne, but on her. Sarah stood on a high, windswept balcony, carved from the mountain's peak, the wind a living thing that tugged at her long, dark hair, and whipped the hem of a heavy cloak lined with snow leopard fur. The air here was thin, sharp, and so clean it felt like drinking from a celestial spring. It tasted of ice, ozone, and freedom. Far below, the world was a breathtaking tapestry of shadow-dark forests and sun-kissed, snow-dusted peaks that stretched to the edge of the world. This was the heart of the North, the seat of the Alpha King, and it was now her home. She was no longer the gray stone hiding by the hearth. She was the mountain. She was the storm. The ghost of the Northern Fang was a story told by others, a myth she herself scarcely remembered. The woman who stood here now was forged in the fire Jastor had promised. He had not lied. He had dragged her wolf screaming back into the light, and in doing so had dragged her soul along with it. Her wolf was not a separate entity now, not a caged thing. It was a part of her, a warm, powerful current that flowed through her blood, sharpening her senses, deepening her connection to the wild world around her. She could feel the pulse of the vast territory below, the lifeblood of the pack sworn to the crown, a complex and ever-shifting web of which she was now a vital central thread. Her eyes, which had found their true gold in the heart of the wood that day, now saw the world with a clarity that was both a blessing and a burden. She raised a hand, her fingers tracing the intricate silvery mark that now graced her throat. It was not a simple bite mark, not the crude claiming of a lesser alpha. Jastor's mark was a whirl of elegant, scar-like lines, a symbol that mirrored the ancient sigil of his house, a wolf's head crowned by the North Star. It had been sealed not in a public ceremony, but under the light of the blood moon, a primal sacrament of blood, will, and a bond so profound it had shaken the foundations of their souls. It was a claiming, yes, but it had also been a surrender, his to her as much as hers to him. The Northern Fang was a distant memory. Alpha Gregor, faced with the undeniable truth of Ceres's awakened power and the unyielding will of his king, had bent the knee. He still ruled, but he was a diminished figure, his authority forever checked, his pride broken. His daughter Elka had been sent south, a political marriage to seal an alliance with a dusty border pack, an exile cloaked in the guise of honor. The pack had learned its lesson. Fealty was, indeed, the air they breathed. A heavy warmth settled behind her, a presence so familiar, so intrinsically a part of her now, that she didn't need to turn. The scent of him, winter storms and ancient pines, was a constant comfort, the anchor of her new world. A large calloused hand covered hers, his fingers lacing with her own, where her hand rested on the cold stone of the balustrade. "You stare at the horizon as if you mean to conquer it," Jastor's voice rumbled, a low, intimate sound meant only for her. She smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached her golden eyes. "I am merely admiring my husband's work." She turned her head, looking up at him. The scars on his face were no longer terrifying maps of a brutal king, but familiar, beloved lines on the face of her mate. The winter sky gray of his eyes, once so cold and piercing, now held a deep, abiding warmth whenever they looked at her. He was still a storm, still a force of nature, but she was no longer a ship to be battered by his waves. She was the sea itself, and he was her tide. "Our work," he corrected, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "A kingdom is not held by one wolf, but by two. A king is only as strong as his queen." He leaned down, his lips brushing her temple, a gesture of quiet affection that still, after a year, sent a jolt of liquid heat through her. She leaned back against the solid wall of his chest, her head resting on his shoulder, and they looked out at the vast wilderness together. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a silence that was not empty, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. "The quiet life, the girl you were?" She considered the question. She thought of the ghost by the fire, of the girl whose world had been defined by what she had lost. Liam's memory was no longer a shrine of sorrow. It was a scar, a part of her story, the tragic prologue that had, in the fate's cruel and unknowable way, led her here. His death had shattered her, yes, but Jastor had been right. She had not been broken completely. He had simply gathered the pieces and shown her how to forge them into something stronger. "She was not living, Jastor," Ceres answered, her voice clear and strong in the thin mountain air. "She was waiting, for a death that wouldn't come. I do not miss her. I pity her." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his hard, bearded jaw. "You did not give me a quiet life. You gave me a life, a real one, a loud and dangerous and magnificent one. A slow smile, a rare and powerful thing, touched his lips. It transformed his harsh features, revealing the man beneath the crown. He lowered his head, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in a white cloud in the cold air. "And you," he murmured, his voice a raw, husky whisper that vibrated through her. "You saved me from a kingdom of stone and a throne of ice. You are the fire in the heart of my winter, Ceres." He kissed her then, a kiss that was not about claiming or dominance, but about a deep and absolute belonging. It was the kiss of two souls who had been forged in the same fire, two wolves who had found their other half against all odds. It was the promise of 1,000 dawns to come, of a shared reign, of a love as fierce and wild as the north itself. He was the storm that had found her, and she was the wild, beating heart of his kingdom. And in the silent, golden light of the rising sun, the north was finally and forever whole.